The Global Citizenship Education Interview Series and UNESCO-IBE are delighted to host the launch of the Prospect special issue, Reimagining Global Citizenship Education through Decolonial, Ethical, and Critical Lenses. To begin with, I would like to thank Simona Poppa, Executive Editor of UNESCO's Prospects Journal, Kadira Malko, Head of Communications and Advocacy, and Director Costanza Farina, who is with us today, and the entire UNESCO-IBE and Global Citizenship Education Interview Series team for co-organizing and promoting this important event. My name is Emiliano Bosio, Professor of Education based in Japan and Director of the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series. The Global Citizenship Education Interview Series is an open access global platform on YouTube, which brings together a community, at least to date, of over 20,000 educators from schools, universities, and international institutions, including UNESCO and beyond. My line of work focuses on critical, transformative, ethical, and values-based global citizenship. And I have authored and co-authored and edited several books, including Conversations on Global Citizenship Education and New Conversations on Global Citizenship Education in Routledge, Global Citizenship Education in the Global South with Yusef Waghid, who is here with us today, Value Creating Education, The Emergence of the Ethical Engaged University, and more recently, Ethical Global Citizenship Education in Cambridge University Press. I'm also the chief editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Global Citizenship Education, which will be published by Oxford University Press, again with my colleague and friend Yusef Waghid. And this handbook is quite important because it will offer a comprehensive examination of global citizenship education across recent decades, featuring diverse voices from both the global north and the global south. And lastly, let me mention I'm also the chief editor of the new Routledge, Taylor and Francis book series called Transformative Dialogues on Global Citizenship Education. So if you're interested in submitting an idea for a book project, please do get in touch privately. So today's global conversation brings together several scholars, including Costanza Farina, director of UNESCO-IBE, Yusef Waghid, my co-editor for the special issue we are launching today, Hans David, Miri Yemini, Yoko Mochizuki, Matthew Witenstein, and Aryn Baxter, and myself, to explore how global citizenship education can cultivate ethical values, foster social justice, inclusion, and equity, and at the same time promote critical, transformative, and decolonial pedagogies in our interconnected and yet unequal planet. I use the word planet with a capital P on purpose, as the word planet embraces both humans and non-humans to signal the wonderful diversity existing in our current societies nowadays. So please note that this event is video recorded, as I mentioned at the beginning of our event, and will be featured on the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series YouTube channel, which recently reached over 20,000 subscribers, connecting educators and leaders from schools, universities, and international institutions worldwide. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker today, UNESCO-IBE Director Costanza Farina, who will open this special issue event with her remarks. Costanza Farina was appointed Director of the UNESCO International Bureau of Education, IBE, in 2025. Earlier that year, she served as Director for Crisis and Response Preparedness and Field Coordination in UNESCO sector for Priority Africa and External Relations. Her distinguished United Nations career began in 1985 with the United Nations Development Programme in Yemen, and includes senior roles with the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees, the International Labour Organization, and multiple UNESCO offices across the Middle East and North Africa. She has served as UNESCO representative in Palestine, Lebanon, the Syrian Arabic Republic, Jordan, and the Gulf states, as well as UN resident coordinator in Libya and Jordan. Director Costanza Farina, it is a real pleasure to welcome you today to this event. We warmly welcome your opening remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emiliano. Good afternoon, dear colleagues, friends, and partners. Best greetings from IBE in Geneva. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today to launch this special issue of Prospects dedicated, as just mentioned, to global citizen education, a topic that speaks directly to UNESCO vision and to the heart of the work that we do at the International Bureau of Education. Over the past decades, global citizenship education, GCE, has moved from the margin of policy debate to the center of the international education dialogue. When the Global Education First initiative was launched in 2012, it reminded us that education is not only about preparing young people for work, but is also about preparing them for the world and the planet, as you were saying, Professor Emiliano. He called on education systems to prepare learners to understand and to address complex reality of our time, including conflicts, migration, digital transformation, and sustainability challenges. That vision was reaffirmed in 2015 when GCE became part of the Sustainable Development Goal 4 and specifically Target 4.7. Since then, national curricula around the world have been striving to translate this global aspiration into meaningful local learning experiences. At its core, GCE is about developing the values, the knowledge, and dispositions that enable learners to act with empathy, responsibility, and sense of shared humanity. It asks how education can help young people not only to live in the world, but to shape it ethically and collectively. Yet, as this special issue reminds us, global citizenship education is not a fixed or settled idea. It continues to evolve, informed by diverse theoretical and cultural traditions, critical, decolonial, humanistic, or transformative. This diversity is its strength. It pushes us to ask hard but key questions. How do we ensure that GCE reflects not only global ideals, but also the lived experiences and knowledge systems of all communities, especially in the Global South? How can we move beyond abstract rhetoric to pedagogies that truly empower learners to think critically and compassionately? This issue, co-edited by Professor Emiliano Bosio and Professor Yusef Waghid, makes an important and timely contribution to these questions. It calls for reimagining the GCE not as a neutral or technocratic framework, but as a transformative educational practice rooted in ethical relationships, cultural humility, and social justice. The articles in this special issue explore how educators around the world are weaving these ideas into their work in classrooms, communities, and curricula. They show that when GCE is grounded in critical reflection and local realities, it can become a powerful space for rethinking how we live together on this planet. For us at IBE, these conversations resonate deeply. As UNESCO Global Platform for Knowledge, Dialogue and Cooperation on Curriculum and Pedagogy, the IBE works closely with all UNESCO member states to design curricula that build on competencies, values, mindset needed for peaceful and sustainable societies. In that sense, the questions at the heart of these special issues special issue about purpose, pedagogy, and citizenship are the very questions that guide our daily work. The IBE focus on curriculum transformation through our capacity development and technical assistance project and through our publications and policy dialogue initiatives aims to make education not only more relevant, but more human. So I want to thank Emiliano, Yusef, and all the contributors for these inspiring collections. Thank you really so much for your engagement. You remind us that global citizenship education is not about producing one kind of global citizen. It is about nurturing the capacity to care, to question, and to act with integrity in a shared and fragile world. Thank you again for your engagement, for your commitment, your scholarship, and your partnership. And congratulations to all for this very important publication. Thank you, Emiliano.
Okay, thank you, UNESCO-IBE Director Costanza Farina, for these excellent words. I want to briefly address the question of why this special issue, reimagining global citizenship education through decolonial, ethical, and critical lenses, is both needed and powerful. So this special issue is both needed and powerful because it speaks to a profound transformation unfolding in global citizenship education today. For too long, the field has been shaped primarily by perspectives rooted in a limited set of geographical and epistemic traditions, particularly from the global north. And so while these contributions have been valuable, they have also left us with what I would call an incomplete picture, one that does not fully capture the diversity of the lived experiences, forms of knowledge, and also ethical commitments that shaped our shared planet. And again, I use the word planet with a capital P on purpose, as the word planet embraces both humans and non-humans to signal the wonderful, rich diversity existing in our societies today. So what this special issue does is open a new space, a necessary space where voices from across regions, traditions, and struggles can speak with rather than after one another. It brings forward perspectives that are too often marginalized, perspectives shaped by histories of inequality, by the daily realities of injustice, and by the creative, hopeful, and courageous work of educators seeking to empower learners with critical consciousness. This issue is powerful because it recenters ethics, responsibilities, and human and non-human dignity at the heart of global citizenship education. It challenges us, educators, learners, practitioners, leaders, to move beyond superficial understandings of global competence and instead to imagine global citizenship education as a transformative, critical, and justice-driven project. It reminds us that global citizenship cannot and should not be reduced to mobility or internationalization, or simply making students job ready for the international job market, important as it is. Global citizenship education, at least in my opinion, and based on Yusef and I perspectives in shaping this special issue, global citizenship education must be rooted in solidarity, activism, dignity, and reimagining our shared futures. And finally, this issue, this special issue, matters because it brings together a community, many of whom are here with us today, who believe that global citizenship education, and I should say education at large, must be more than preparation for the global economy. Let me repeat this again because it's central. Global citizenship education as a project that goes beyond preparation for the global economy. It must be instead a collective act of emancipation, a commitment to social justice and equity, a pathway toward world peace. It seems to me that our contributors have taken up this challenge because it is a real challenge to frame global citizenship education from a social justice perspective, but they've taken up this challenge with courage, depth, creativity, imagination, and through their work, this special issue becomes not only a reflection of where the global citizenship education field is, but what I call a roadmap of where global citizenship education urgently needs to go. Thank you very much. Now, let me introduce the next speaker. I want to introduce Yusef Waghid, who will speak about our co-authored paper, Cultivating Students' Critical Consciousness Through Global Citizenship Education, 6 Pedagogical Priorities. Yusef Waghid is Emeritus Professor of Philosophy of Education at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. He is the recipient of the prestigious Education Research in Africa Award from the Association for the Development of Education in Africa. He served as Dean of the Faculty of Education at Stellenbosch University and continues to influence educational philosophy across the continent. His work advances Ubuntu-based educational discourse grounded in communal values, ethical reasoning, and social justice, continuing to influence higher education philosophy in Africa and beyond. Yusef, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Emiliano, and good afternoon, colleagues. Our understanding of global citizenship education is that it is a concept supported by action. So what it means, it's an action concept. And because we are both influenced by Freirean pedagogy, we thought it apposite that global citizenship education has to have a critical consciousness function. And in that sense, global citizenship education will have to be able to cultivate students, learners, and educators who become or are critically conscious. And like any form of education, our understanding is that the action of education is never a finished product. It's always in becoming. So like education, GCE is also in becoming. What we articulate as a rationale for global citizenship education is that, for critical consciousness, by the way, is that it has a transformative, a moral, and political function. And it ought to address issues of structural injustice, colonial legacies, and global inequities. So one can already see how GCE is aimed at achieving an ethically or morally worthwhile end. So what does GCE for critical consciousness for us means? It means that GCE foregrounds the development or the cultivation of critically reflective and ethically responsible students and, of course, educators capable of contributing to the pursuit of social justice in both global and local contexts. What it admirably does, it challenges these technicist neoliberal understandings that reduce education, as Emiliano pointed out, to employability but instead cultivate dispositions of care, relationality, such as the notion of Ubuntu mentioned already, human agency, and solidarity among individuals and others. In this case, it would be our students. So this is the rationale that underscores our understanding of global citizenship education. And we hold the view that this particular rationale of GCE has the potential to cultivate at least 6 primary, or what we call core, pedagogical priorities or functions. So what I will do briefly is to look at each one of these 6 pedagogical priorities and consider their implications briefly for teaching, learning. The first pedagogical priority would be praxis. GCE ought to cultivate in praxeological relationships, and this means that GCE, we contend, ought to promote cyclical relationships between reflection and action that will enable students to identify systemic oppression and respond, of course, constructively to it. Now, as by way of an example, within African universities, for instance, this may involve community-engaged learning initiatives, critical inquiry projects, and reflective assessment practices that link learning to social transformation. So that for us would be the praxeological aspect of GCE. The second pedagogical priority would be that of reflexive dialogue. When you have the teaching of GCE culminating in a teaching pedagogy grounded in dialogical engagement that encourages students to interrogate their own positionalities, their own assumptions and values, then that teaching becomes dialogic. For us, dialogical classrooms would facilitate respectful and dignified engagement across difference, recognizing difference, and of course, enabling students to reflect on who they are becoming as ethical and responsible global citizens. The third priority, as a manifestation of this particular rationale of GCE, would be the possibility of a decolonial orientation. So it is through GCE that institutions and structures and practices are challenged in the sense that dominant hegemonic forms of knowledge knowledges are challenged. And how it is done? Because GCE foregrounds the notion of epistemic plurality. There's a plurality of understandings about knowledge, and of course, intellectual traditions as well. It would become possible for GCE to play a decolonial role. So the implication is pedagogical practices would then involve interrogating or questioning or even resisting and opposing historical and contemporary colonial power relations, centering African or marginalized perspectives, and affirming diverse identities and languages in teaching and learning. And this is the way how GCE can possibly manifest in its decolonial, in cultivating a decolonial agenda. That would be our third priority of GCE. The fourth one would be the cultivation of an ethics of care. For GCE, it is central to be committed or remain committed to the establishment of social justice. and this would imply that humans have to act with a kind of benevolence of shared responsibility, that they do things with others and do not act on their own. So this kind of association that should be pursued based on based on caring and not a kind of a paternalistic benevolence. This notion of caring, where humans do things in recognition that they can associate with one another, should cultivate this sense of relationality. In African parlance, we would call it Ubuntu. I am because we are. So we are relational beings. And when we do so empathetically and with compassion as a collective being, we can possibly enhance any our opposition, rather. We can enhance our opposition to neoliberal individualism through this association in terms of the collective, but based on a notion that GCE is committed to an ethics of care. The fifth priority would be one whereby GCE recognizes the ecological interdependence and challenges the whole notion of anthropocentric assumptions. So students here should be encouraged to reflect on environmental injustices and reflect on its sustainability. And of course, the ethical significance of more than human forms of life. Hence Emiliano's reference to planet on 3 occasions. So this aligns with the idea that regions that are ecologically challenged, including those regions in the world where climate vulnerability and resource inequality are so rife, they can be significantly attended to. And this is how GCE can possibly live out its eco-critical perspective. And then sixthly, for me, by far a highly significant priority of GCE is the possibility to empower humanity. You empower you because GCE focuses and nurtures dignity, interdependence, and the capacity for collective actions. So when students develop this ability to act ethically in response to injustices, recognizing themselves as part of a larger human community, they become empowered. So empowerment is both personal, that's the self-formation, it's interpersonal in the relationships with others, and it has a socio-political end in mind, that is participation in justice-oriented change in society. So in that way, GCE can contribute towards the empowerment of humanity. And these are the 6 priorities we accentuate in our contribution, where how GCE can be lived out or manifest. So finally, a GCE for critical consciousness, in our view, offers higher education a pedagogical framework that aligns with a constitutional commitment to social justice, transformation, and human dignity. And by integrating these 6 priorities, praxis, dialogue, decoloniality, caring ethics, eco-criticism, and human empowerment, educators can possibly cultivate learning environments that prepare students not only to understand the world, but to act ethically and collectively to transform it. Thank you very much, Emiliano.
Thank you, Yusef. That was a wonderful illustration of the core principles of the paper. Next, I'd like to welcome Professor Hans de Wiet, speaking on our dialogic paper, Fostering Service to Society, Inclusion and Equity Through Global Citizenship Education. Hans de Wiet is Distinguished Fellow at the Center for International Higher Education, Boston College, and Emeritus Professor of the Practice in International Higher Education at Boston College Lynch School of Education and Human Development. From 2015 to 2020, he served as a full-time director of the Center for International Higher Education. He continues to advise organizations such as the European Commission, UNESCO, OECD, and the Council of Europe on policy and practice in higher education internationalization. The biography of Professor de Wiet is rich and very long. I said just this is an extract. Very welcome, Hans, and we look forward to hearing your perspectives.
Thank you, Emiliano, and thank you, Yusef, also Costanza, for your introductory remarks, and congratulations on this launch of this special issue on global citizenship education. I think it is a very timely moment to have this publication coming in front, because we are living, unfortunately, in very complicated times. We see all the challenges of geopolitical sense. We see increased populism and nationalism, inward-looking, anti-global, anti-immigration, anti-education even to some extent. We see all the dangers of artificial intelligence and also the opportunities, by the way, but in particular, we have to look at all the ethical aspects of it. It is important that we try as much as possible in this complicated times to work on a true responsible global citizenship education and to maintain effort to mutual understanding internationally, international exchange, international collaboration, all those aspects that many of you like me have been working on for many years, which is challenged now. We need to continue to make it truly valuable for our planet with a big P, as Emiliano says, possible. So we have to understand at the same time that global citizenship education has always been also a tendency to be very elitist. I think Emiliano also referred to that. It was basically for a small part of the world. It was small for an elite of students in education at all levels. It was neo-colonial, dominant by the big powers. It was also ignoring, in many aspects, the local context in which we have to operate. And I think if we talk about global citizenship education, we have to combine the global and the local much more in our perception. We are not global citizens that are CEOs of multinationals or diplomats, but we are citizens that live and work in our countries, in our cities, in our jobs, and have to be understanding that interculturality is part of that whole notion as well. We also have to be aware that the elitism of global citizenship education means that there is a lot of lip service in documents, policy documents by international organizations, by national governments, but also by schools and universities that say, well, we are advocating global citizenship, but lacking action and concrete innovation and implementation. That's a big challenge that we see. In the work that I do on internationalization of the curriculum and internationalization at home, we see the same kind of tendency. Documents say, well, it is very important, but what they do, they don't take any action. They keep looking at the mobility of students, the mobility of staff, the mobility of programs for only a very small, minor percentage of 2% of the global population that are having benefits of that. So we have to be much more inclusive in that sense, as we have been saying, and we have to address the equity issue of global citizenship much more. So it is important, as also Yusef said, why are we doing this? We have to be much more clear why it is important, what the rationales are for continuing to emphasize the importance of global citizenship, and then see how what can we do to make that happen? So I really appreciated Yusef's interpretation of the 6 points that he made to say, well, this is why it's important. This is what we have to do to be active and to be responsible and to be transformative in doing that. In each of our contexts, because what we see in particular, what I mentioned before, the challenge that we face of inward-looking nationalism, populism, is in particular happening in the dominant global north high-income countries. And what we see is a counter development happening in low and mid-income countries in the global south. And we have to be aware of how they now are able and needing to respond in a much more equity and inclusive way and a transformative way to do that, and not copying what we have done or what we have not done even in the global north. So it's important to emphasize this inclusion, to emphasize this need for social justice, this equity. Betty Lisk is from Australia and is one of the experts on internationalization of the curriculum, wrote already 10 years ago, when we talk about global citizenship, we have to add the word responsible. We have to create a responsible global citizenship, which is responsible for our planet, which is focusing on the needs of the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes social justice, which includes equity, all the concerns that we have in our world. So responsibility should be much more emphasized when we talk about global citizenship education than ever before. And it's important to do that in an interactive way, and using also the opportunities that are there for being much more interactive. We don't have to be physically mobile. We now can use, like we do in this session, we can use the digital possibilities to interact, to include much more students, to include much more professors, to include much more people from the outside world in our interactions. We don't have necessarily to destroy our planet by flying around. We can do this way as well. And so don't only think about digitalization, artificial intelligence as a challenge, which it is, and it has all kind of negative potential ethical concerns, but also as an opportunity to be much more equitable, to be much more inclusive in the way we deal with global citizenship education in the future. And that, I think, is a message that we all understand, but we have to transfer. And I hope that this special issue and the chapters in the special issue will contribute to make indeed global citizenship education much more responsible, much more inclusive, and much more transformative than it has been so far. So thank you very much and congratulations on this issue.
Thank you, Hans. Excellent. Very interesting. Okay, so next speaker, let me introduce Miri Yemini. Today, Miri will discuss themes from her paper, A Scoping Review of Research on School-Age Youth Activism in Global Citizenship Education. Miri Yemini is professor at the Technion Israel Institute of Technology and a leading scholar in youth studies, global citizenship education, and educational policy. With over 100 publications, her research span youth activism, democratic civic education, and the intersection of education and health. Her current work examines how policy and lived experience shape youth well-being in times of global crisis. Miri, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you, Emiliano, and thank you all for joining us here. So over the next couple of minutes, I'll walk you through this topic. It's actually part of our European Research Council funded project aimed to understand how young people understand and appropriate activism. In this specific piece, we looked into global citizenship education. I don't want to use my time to introduce the topic, but obviously it's important part of the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And in general, we all know that it has broad and multiple interpretations. And our paper that was co-authored with my colleagues Carla and Tatiana looks specifically into a global citizenship connection and activism. And since the idea of global citizenship education is about equipping the learners to gain skills, critically engaged with various perspectives, and foster just, peaceful and sustainable world, it kind of as was mentioned by Professor Waghid, interferes with the Freire concepts of critical consciousness and includes action. So our idea was to look into what research in the field is about and how activism, students' activism, school-age student activism is featured in contemporary research. We basically searched a decade of academic papers published in peer-reviewed journals, looked into the keywords including various combinations of youth, students, pupils, etc., activism, including protests and lobbying and advocacy, and global citizenship education and global learning. Eventually, after screening techniques and inclusion and exclusion exercise, we came to analyze in depth 43 relevant studies, and we had basically several questions. First of all, what are the themes and trends in global citizenship education literature concerning involvement of young people in activism? How schools incorporate activism and which specific forms of activism are being promoted? And finally, what are the pedagogical approaches, subject areas, and thematic foci that are evident in this body of literature? So in terms, I'll skip the detailed methodology directly into findings. In terms of discipline and school level, we saw that most of the research was published in the field of education with some small overlap in sociology and political science. So we can say that a majority of research focused on high school students, with much fewer studies concerning younger students, which also something that we need to think about. Perhaps it's perceived as easier or requires more resource-intensive efforts and not suitable for younger children, which I think research, critical research, so shows that it's not true. In terms of geographical distribution that was mentioned here at this webinar several times, we saw a significant trend of dominance of global north countries in the publication, as in most academic publications. It raises questions about equity and social privilege. If we look into the forms of activism that were promoted or were measured in the studies, we can look, basically most of them included critical inquiry, which is the most prevalent, focusing mainly on analytical skill, thinking and awareness of global issues. So it's part of the activism, but it not contains real action. Some of the studies, about half, involved volunteering and community engagement, and only a handful of studies involved political voice and actual activism. In terms of the school subjects and themes, I perhaps would like to say that most of the research focused on social sciences, civics and arts and humanities. Natural sciences were less represented, as you might assume. And the themes were mostly addressed as human rights, environmental issues, and social justice. In terms of methods, the way schools implemented global citizenship education, Many schools, so half of the studies showed a cross-curricular integration, meaning that global citizenship education, despite being dominant in social studies, as I mentioned, is integrated in various subjects in schools. We found that many NGOs were involved in teaching and preparing curriculum materials for global citizenship education. However, a whole school approach was less common. In terms of pedagogical approach, most studies looked into service learning, which was most frequently used through community projects, and some of them, again, were about transformative critical engagement, reflective, active, and collaborative. So in terms of service learning, it mostly was related to international baccalaureate schools, where global citizenship education is more integrated into the curriculum. In terms of teachers' role, teachers were treated as facilitators, connecting students with global and local communities. However, less emphasis were found on teachers promoting critical reading of the materials or encouraging actual political actions. In summary, we showed that activism is not very prominent theme in global citizenship education studies, and we can consider why and what should be done in the on the ground to encourage teachers to engage with activism more directly. And obviously, the issue of resources, it was mentioned here before, physical mobility, etc. Most of the studies were addressing global citizenship education as research-intensive practice, which obviously in turn increases inequality instead of decreasing it. We end this essay with suggesting developing more comprehensive global citizenship education programs. We advocate for the whole school approach, including critical inquiry and facilitation of actual action of students, providing teacher training, which is obvious for people who are working in the field, but not so obviously in the field itself. And we are suggesting encouraging more research on activism and global citizenship education among younger students. We believe that, well, I would argue that activism is a core aspect in global citizenship education, and it should be studied more critically, but also implemented more rigorously. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Miri. And next speaker is Yoko. Yoko Mochizuki will discuss 2 or 3 core themes from her paper, Can the Subaltern Decolonize? The Limits and Possibilities of Decolonial Global Citizenship Education in India. Yoko Mochizuki is Associate Professor in the Department of Social Sciences and Policy Studies at the Education University of Hong Kong, with a secondary affiliation to the Academy of Applied Policy Studies and Education Futures. She previously served as the head of policy at UNESCO-IBE New Delhi, program specialist for ESD and climate change at UNESCO Paris, and ESD specialist at the United Nations University Institute for the Advanced Study of Sustainability. Yoko, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Emiliano, and thank you very much for having me. So the title of my paper, Can the Subaltern Decolonize? This is, of course, a note to Gayatri Spivak, professor at Columbia University, whose essay, Can the Subaltern Speak?, provided a seminal account of epistemic violence and is widely considered a foundational text of post-colonial studies. So my paper focuses on India, but I would like to start my talk, my intervention, by sharing some biographical backstories. The first backstory is about my upbringing and education. I attended all-girls Catholic school in Tokyo from kindergarten to high school. So for 2 years of preschool and 12 years of primary, secondary education, I was at a kind of exclusive, elitist Catholic school. And probably about 30% of my classmates were Catholic. And this is a very unique environment for a Japanese student because Christian population in Japan is about only 1 to 2% of the entire population, combining both Protestants and Catholics. So I had, like, as a Japanese student, I had a exposure to Christianity and also European languages from very early on. And I think, of course, when I was younger, I wasn't like self-reflexive about my privileges or, you know, the meaning of being educated in that kind of environment. But I think, in a way, in a very superficial way, I wanted to become a global citizen. And I really loved studying English and French. And then I pursued my graduate education in the United States. And then I worked for UNESCO. So in a way, I was kind of like living a dream of as a global citizen. And the second backstory I want to share is that this concerns what I learned from my interactions with my Indian colleagues at UNESCO. Although I attended a Christian school, my entire primary, secondary education, and also undergraduate education in Japan, entirely in Japanese. So of course, I'm like I read and write in Japanese very, very fluently, and that's my native language. So I still read a lot of Japanese books, and my colleagues are like very surprised to see me reading in Japanese because they almost without exception, my Indian colleagues, they were educated in English. So they're like, oh, you read Japanese. I can't, you know, I'm not very comfortable reading in Hindi so they were like, they couldn't imagine that the entire education system in Japan from primary to tertiary, even PhD studies, they are all in Japanese. And indeed, it is like unthinkable for upper caste, middle class parents in India to allow their children to study in the same classroom with children from underprivileged sections of society. Once I asked an Indian colleague of mine with very strong social justice principles, because she was just like deciding her son's school. So I asked very casually, innocently, I really didn't know because that was like my first year in India. I asked her, like, why would you like to send your son to a private school? And her response was that like to send her son to a government school meaning like a public school in vernacular. She told me that to send her son to a government school would feel like a violation of human rights. And this really, this was a really shocking statement to me, but this reflects the wider reality of what is considered, what is described by Gayatri Spivak as class apartheid in India. So with these two backstories, I would like to turn to my paper, Can the Subaltern Decolonize? In this paper, drawing on Gayatri Spivak, I highlighted an insurmountable epistemic disconnect, epistemic discontinuity between the urban elite and marginalized sections of Indian society. Spivak wrote, quote, "To be able to present a project that will draw aid from the North, to understand and state a problem intelligibly and persuasively for the taste of the North, is itself proof of a sort of epistemic discontinuity with the ill-educated rural poor. This discontinuity, not skin color or national identity crudely understood, undergirds the question of who always writes and who is perennially wrong. Here, I hope to draw attention to the kind of epistemic discontinuity witnessed within India and to explore some of the implications for critiquing modernity or / coloniality in the Indian context. How can global citizenship education become more the fashionable synonym of the 21st century skills for the globally mobile elite? In a sharply stratified education system in India, the polarized divisions of society are unlikely to be present in the classroom. And global citizenship education will likely reach only privileged students. Discussing global citizenship among the privileged is very limited in terms of moving beyond intellectual understanding of the roots of inequality and violence, and towards cultivating empathy and compassion for the subaltern. Moreover, even if efforts are made to move towards critical global citizenship education, and I analyzed this in my paper in detail, uncritically embracing like a very superficial kind of decolonial lens could be counterproductive to the goals of greater equality and justice, as it could allow privileged Indians to cast themselves as victims entitled to purging impurities resulting from alien influences, including Islamic and Western colonization in the history. So I argue that in my paper, a decolonial shift in global citizenship education in the Indian context requires creating spaces where India's privileged can explore epistemic violence, not as victims, but as those who have taken it for granted that they are entitled to civilizing rural, tribal, and poor children. Mahatma Gandhi understood the divisive and destructive nature of a Western-style education in the Indian context and advocated craft-centered education known as basic education or Nai Talim. And this Nai Talim aimed at overcoming the divide between intellectual and manual work based on caste, and making a sharp contrast to this Gandhi's pedagogic ideas. Amartya Sen, whom we all love, I would say one of the most cherished Indian scholars and thinkers, together with his longtime collaborator, Jean Drèze, Amartya Sen characterized Gandhi's craft-based basic education as an Indian folly, which created an upper class and upper caste bias against the education of the masses. So here I argue that Amartya Sen failed to see that Gandhi wanted to dismantle colonial legacies and aiming for systemic change. So we could say Gandhi was he was trying to implement decolonial approaches, which failed. And in today's context, it's easy to say that Amartya Sen failed to see Gandhi's decolonial approaches, but at the same time, it is extremely difficult to justify depriving anyone of modern or Western schooling opportunities. In fact, it goes directly against SDG 4 on inclusive and equitable quality education for all. So how to make a big colonial shift in education is a profound question, not just in relation to global citizenship education, but in education in general. So I would like to conclude by saying that global citizenship education, of course, needs to critically examine its inherited colonial concepts and to critique Western modernity / coloniality, the underlying logic of extraction, separability, nature, culture divide, this binary framing and everything a lot of great scholars have critiqued. Efforts to decolonize global citizenship education must address epistemic discontinuity within the Indian society and its implications for social justice and collective liberation. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much to Yoko. And now let me introduce the next speaker. Matthew Whiston and Aryn Baxter will share their thoughts from the paper, A Scoping Study of Education for Sustainable Development and Global Citizenship Education in Higher Education. Matthew Whiston is Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy at the University of New Mexico and Senior Research Fellow at the School of Educational Study, Claremont Graduate University. His U.S. research focuses on immigrants in higher education and international educational experiences, while his comparative studies examine higher education quality, organization, and governance across global context. Aryn Baxter is Associate Director of International Agriculture at Colorado State University. She teaches graduate courses in extension education and advances global engagement efforts within the College of Agricultural Sciences. Her work focuses on designing and evaluating programs that expand access to global learning opportunities, equipping students to understand and address global sustainability challenges. So Matthew, Aryn, the floor is yours.
Thanks for inviting us here. Great to see everybody. So just quickly, the impetus of our study really was grounded in our good colleague, Radhika Iyengar's project over at the Center for Sustainable Development, where she had all of this K-12 theory to practice sort of applied practices across GCE and ESD, but there was very limited information on higher education. So we wanted to really scope the literature to find out how are people theorizing and conceptualizing GCE and ESD? How might they be connected? And what are some of those applied understandings too? So I guess part of our belief is that they should be connected, and we wanted to understand sort of the synergy between them and some of the distinctions that they may show. So we believe that it's crucial for higher education to take stock in how campuses are applying and addressing these potentially synergistic practices to begin providing clearer policy direction. So part of what we did, we decided that we were going to look in the higher education literature versus across literature to find out what there is about GCE and ESD in higher education, if that makes sense. So we scoped the literature over a decade in higher education journals and in other journals focused on higher education. So for example, like the Journal of Geography in Higher Education. So discipline journals that are studying their discipline in higher education. And part of what we found was that there's a much more predominant focus on ESD than GCE in the 149 articles that we ended up distilling down from a much bigger set through a set of keywords, right? There's a good set of articles on GCE, and then we also looked at a group of articles that overlap both GCE and ESD. But the preponderance of those articles, as we found, we're looking more at ESD alone. So I'm going to talk quickly just about the research question that we have. What are the distinctions and overlaps in both the theoretical and conceptual framing and the study focus of ESD and GCE studies within the higher education literature? So one of the things that we did was develop a Venn diagram to see like where are these overlaps and what are some of the distinctions in how people are theorizing and conceptualizing this. And we invite you to take a look at that. And we were hoping that by distilling everything down into a couple of figures, at least, could sort of give people a lay of the land. So just a few examples. In terms of this, in the part of the Venn diagram in the middle where you see this overlap of ESD and GCE, we found several themes. One of them was this idea of environmental citizenship. And just a couple of examples from that literature. Ferguson and Roof studied higher education's role in attaining SDG 4 outcomes through a case study at the University of the West Indies, where they framed deliberate actions toward a citizenry knowledgeable about ESD and GCE, wherein classrooms and campuses in practice and theory are living laboratories for sustainability. So it combined both that ESD and GCE. And one more example there, Glover and colleagues created this baselining tool where they created a framework called ESD-GC. So basically combining that and connecting that, therefore it sort of connected higher education's work alongside the national strategies they were talking about. So the Welsh government then adopted this terminology of ESDGC to sort of forge a bridge between the citizenship element of sustainability alongside the environmental agenda. And there were three other themes, including internationalization of ESD and GCE in this sort of in-between space. And so we invite you to take a look further, but in the interest of time, I'll quickly share just some quick look into the GCE themes. So the distinctiveness of what people were looking at in GCE alone. So one of them was going global, which is something you often see in the literature. Another one was this idea of transcultural critical thinking for social justice. And so in that set of articles, and in the interest of time, I'll move on because we're getting close. What was really interesting was that these distinctions within the only GCE alone articles highlight novel ways in which teachers and programs develop growth opportunities to enhance GCE awareness with efforts seeking transformation versus those very surface level GCE attempts. So they also demonstrate keen awareness toward building academic structures to support student learning in their programs and collaboration for socially just engagement in diverse communities. And as I pass it on to Aryn, you'll find a lot of examples that we've sort of collected within the themes so that people have kind of an understanding of how we go from theory to practice and how people are conceptualizing that sort of interconnection between ESD and GCE and each of them alone.
Thanks, Matt, for the overview. I wanted to just really briefly highlight at a high level what we identified in our study as being some of the prominent strategies or mechanisms that higher education institutions are using both across the GCE and ESD areas of focus. So, of course, most prominently was this emphasis on curricular and pedagogical change. I think the focus on criticality, decoloniality was somewhat limited when you look broadly across the literature, although there was some focus on that, particularly around thinking about where these efforts can be connected with some emphases in different contextual contexts. So I think of a few studies focused on the South African context and sort of synergizing a focus on ESD and GCE with a focus on decolonizing the curriculum. Came up in some places, but not really across all. So definitely an important area for expansion there. A really substantial emphasis on community engaged pedagogy, these experiential kind of problem-based pedagogical practices really grounded in local realities. And to support this emphasis on curricular and pedagogical change, certainly a widespread focus on professional development. As Miri was mentioning in her presentation, this emphasis on pre-service teachers was certainly a focus in the higher ed literature, but also on thinking about faculty and administration as part of that process, which also I think kind of connects to one of the cross-cutting themes we identified as a focus on really fostering organizational and systems change to be able to support these efforts across the higher education space. There was a lot of research and conversation around the evaluation and assessment components of this movement toward integration of GCE and ESD across university curriculum and within particular programs, developing ways to define and measure sustainability, literacy, GCE competencies, some really interesting examples of tools combining both of those outcomes. And then, as has been mentioned in some of the presentations today, thinking about technological platforms as opportunities for fostering greater equity in these efforts across the ESD and GCE work. So I know that we're tight on time, so I think I'll just end it there. But really appreciated the opportunity to hear from all the speakers today and see some of these kind of connections across our work.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you. This was a very good way to close this important conversation. Now we have about 5 minutes. Is there any specific question from our audience or simply any reaction thoughts that you are prepared to share? Okay, so I can see someone just posted a couple of questions in our chat. Let's see, for doctoral programs preparing future educators and curriculum scholars, what practical steps can help move from conversation about decoloniality to embedding these values in actual curriculum design or mentoring practices? How might dialogical relational approaches inspired by Freirean Praxis help operationalize ethical and decolonial global citizenship education in higher education settings? I can perhaps quickly respond to question 2. Question 1, I will leave it for someone else, or perhaps later on, Zia, you can engage with us individually. These are good questions. The number 2 is particularly interesting to me because the Freirean Praxis characterize many of my publications. I believe one of the perhaps most interesting aspects of your question is that it reminds me how important is dialogic pedagogy in Freirean approaches. So, for example, the simple idea that we are here today engaging in a diversity of perspectives and putting together thoughts from such a precious diversity of countries with the intent to serve our young learners, right? What we see today is the opposite from our leadership, a complete lack of Freirean open-minded dialogical approach, which then leads to continuous conflicts, which potentially then leads to international conflicts. So I would place at the center of pedagogy, decolonial ethical pedagogy, dialogue. Dialogue is essential nowadays in global citizenship education and beyond that in our societies at large. Why? Because there is a lot of diversity, which is very precious, but nowadays is instrumentalized, as Professor David was mentioning, towards divisiveness rather than constructive approaches to dialogue for the common good. So I would say dialogic pedagogy, dialogue, conversation, respecting diversity, engaging with diversity, with open-mindedness. This is something we need to really put back at the center of our discussions around global citizenship education. I hope this addresses at least partially your question. Perhaps we will need an hour discussion. Thank you, Zia.
Thank you.
Dia, I have some thoughts about the first question, actually. So one of the things we're really considering right now, and this is kind of an answer relatively to your question, number one, as it relates right now to how we're thinking in our educational leadership program and our doctoral program about how do we even understand what the bigger concept and idea of what educational leadership is at the University of New Mexico in a state where there's just such a rich set of diverse cultures in a very unique sort of space. And so what we're starting to think about is how do we actually engage students in helping us consider what that bigger picture of who we are and what we are is, and bringing in their knowledges and values. So we're actually going to conduct like a PAR study of like what that bigger concept is, so that all of the students, alumni, faculty get to work together on developing that, which in its way will help develop the curriculum and how we sort of reinvigorate, redesign the doctoral program. So I think a lot of times people leave out the voices of those within the program, those who have graduated and are out practicing in the field, who have had time to reflect. And then, of course, in concert with the faculty. So sort of bringing that together.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Zia, for the questions. I think we are over time. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and my sincere thanks to our audience, of course, to our all speakers, to the UNESCO-IBE and Global Citizenship Education Interview Series teams for supporting and promoting this event. I believe we should definitely continue this conversation. That's the purpose. One of the purposes of the Global Citizenship Education Interview Series is exactly that, to offer a dialogic platform for engaging in such perspectives. So let's aim for another important collection so that we can discuss it again. Thank you, everyone. Please stay well, take care of yourself, and I will see you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye.